all that. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about Susan Mills Trotter, who is our great-great-great-grandmother. And specifically, we're going to talk about her husband, Joel Trotter. And then we're going to look at the descendants that she has in the Goodson family. And then we're going to go back and look at the ancestors briefly, the Lewis family. And so we'll start off with the husband here. And of course, here's a picture of the Trotters, the Goodsons. And that is Lillian, which is Grandma's mom. And this is her older sister, Marie. A little bit closer view of this. Huh? Her mom's name was Lily. Lily Goodson. Lily Henry Goodson. 2 L's there. But anyway, this is a picture of her when she was 61. Now, what would you say about her there? Would anyone have any words to describe Grandma right here?
She was 61.
61, right there. It's 1972. She was born in 1911. Isn't that 61 years? I think so. Anyway, I was trying to come up with one word. Attractive. That's my word.
Yeah.
But if you can come up with something else, that's better. But she was learning to play the guitar at this time. Now we're going to go way back to the Trotter Cemetery, which is in Carrollton, Missouri. And we've been there before, and we saw Joel's grave, tombstone there, and here it is. We're going all the way back to the Civil War. And the Civil War is when all of this happened. And I want to go over a little bit of background to what was happening to get to the point of his story. But this is the only picture that we have of Susan Mills Trotter is from a newspaper clip. And that's what that is.
Yeah.
And I've just got a portion of it right there because it was with her third husband, which I'll show here in just a few minutes. But this is her oldest daughter, Marion. And you can see there's 2 names on this tombstone. And I'm going to be explaining who the other person is. Alexander Stanley is his name. But we have no picture of Joel Trotter. We only have a picture of his youngest son and of his oldest son. And his youngest son was Frank. He's the first one on the left there. And this was John. And he was born in 1862. Joel died in 1864. And he was born in 1855. And Miriam was born in 1853. So she's the oldest one out of 6 children that she and Joel had. And she ended up with 2 more children, too, from 2 more marriages after Joel passed away. But this is our great-grandfather, James Roy Goodson. I've always wondered, Uncle James was named James Roy. I wonder if he was named after his grandpa. Yeah, that's who it is. That's him right there. And of course, yeah, well, that's my middle name also. So, and there's Grandma. Oh, yeah, Roy, sure. And of course, she lived to be, Susan lived to be 86, lived until 1918. And this was her oldest daughter, right there, Miriam, who was our great-great-grandmother. And now I'm going to go back to September and October of 1864 to get the story of Joel Trotter down. We go back to the northern part of Missouri, north of the Missouri River. We find there's all kinds of conflict taking place, all kinds of turmoil. There was gangs around who were part of the Confederacy. And one of the places that they took was Keatsville. And you can see that it was in the fall of 1864. George Todd took his men, the guerrillas from the Confederate forces, part of Quantrill's raiders. And there were 3 different gangs involved in this, and we'll go over that in just a minute. But this is the landscape right here. General Price was the head of the Confederates there, and he was trying to recruit new soldiers in all of this. And Quantrell's raiders, which was a guerrilla, a gang, and Quantrell, I think, is the man number 2 there in the picture there. They took Keatsville. They destroyed the courthouse. There were 35 men who were the Union soldiers there, and General Price's men came with 250. Now, what's going to take place? Well, they surrendered. And everyone was okay except for the sheriff. They killed him, and they killed a Union spy there. And then they destroyed the courthouse. Just a little background before we get to Joel Trotter here. And so Todd and his men, they went into Chariton, crossing the Grand River at the Rock Ford. And this information comes from the 1881 Carrol County records of Carrol County, 1881. And so they went in. There was 130 men who were occupying Centralia, which was southeast of Keatsville. And there were 300 men that came, including gangs who were part of the guerrilla. And some of the guerrilla gang was Frank James and Jesse James were part of that group. So you can see here that we have Waverly down here, and we have Centralia, where there was 130 men. They came in there with some of the gangs, and they killed every man but 4. And one of the gangs was known as Bloody Bill Anderson. And you can understand why he's called Bloody Bill Anderson. They killed 104 out of the 130 men who were occupying that place. And so here we are in south of the Missouri River. This is October of 1864. And they crossed the Missouri River. 3 men crossed. And General Price gave them leave of absence, and they were to go north into Carrol County and Livingston County, which is right north of Carrol County, and they were to recruit new men. But as they went across the Missouri River, they were wearing Union uniforms. And so they went up to this one house, as Mr. Miller, and it was breakfast time. And they were having breakfast. And they came up there on their horses, and they demanded that food be brought to them. And not that any new food be made, they wanted it right then. And so he was asking them they were asking Mr. Miller some questions. Are there any Union soldiers around here? Well, we haven't seen any, and it doesn't seem to be occupied and all that. So they felt safe in going north, and they went north to Coloma, right here. And then they went through town. Then they went north over into here, into a timber area there. And it was there that these 3 men who were in Union uniforms, and they were actually Confederate soldiers, Captain Beatty found out about them being there, and he took 15 men with him, and he knew that he could just capture these men. There shouldn't be any problems just capturing them. But Captain Perry, one of the Confederate soldiers, picked up his pistol and shot. 1 shot. Well, he couldn't restrain his men, and boy, they went after them, and they killed they killed 2 of them. 1 of them escaped. But after they killed them, they took their uniforms, and 1 of them took the boots off the man, put it on, and they still had good uniforms, and they took those uniforms and used them. And there's all kinds of stories that go about they begged for their lives and all that. Well, we don't know exactly what the story was. But what they found after this is the Confederates were dressed in the Federal uniforms, and they were sufficient to warrant their deaths. And they behaved as bushwhackers, that is, as gang members, and not the regular Confederate soldiers, but they were regular Confederate soldiers. And so they also believed that they belonged to Bill Anderson's, that Bloody Bill Anderson's gang. And part of that gang also included Frank and Jesse James were part of that. And so they shot, and it ended up those 2 men were killed. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is that there were 6 other men out of revenge who lost their lives because of that incident, and 2 were totally innocent. And so I'm going to explain that here in just a moment. So here they are coming up to Carrollton. There were about 300 to 800 Confederate soldiers, and there was about 150 Union soldiers plus 50 citizen militia who were occupying the town. And they come up, and the commander, who was D.A. Williams, his brother Monroe Williams was one of the 2 who was shot by Beatty's group. And so they come up, and he's after revenge. And he comes up there, and he demands that they surrender, and he claims to have 1,500 men, but he didn't have that many. But he claimed to have that many men with artillery, and they were going to take that town no matter what. And so the commander of the Union soldiers, he agreed to meet with him, and he took the surrender. And he said that all the men would be paroled the next day. They'd just lay down their arms, and they'd be paroled. And so they came into town. They had all their guns laid down on the north side of the town. And here comes the Confederate soldiers. But they took them, and they took those 200 men, and they were prisoners for the next 48 hours. They let the officers leave, but one of the officers, the head officer, he wanted to stay with the men. And so what they did is they started sacking all the businesses that were there. They went to every safe they could, and they took the money out of that. But there were some Union soldiers that got out of there with $40,000, and they went north, Chillicothe, and they were able to take that money and some of the money down to a bank in St. Louis. So not everything was lost, but they went up to Chillicothe, and here it is in 1907. I couldn't get a picture of it way back in the Civil War times, but they took all that money. And can you imagine how much $40,000 would be worth today, back in the Civil War times? That's a lot of money that was there. So anyway, they took the 200 men, they took them south out of town, they went across the Missouri River. They were taking these men toward General Price, who was the Confederate general. They went across the Missouri River to Grand Pass, and it was there at Grand Pass that this D.A. Williams, who was the brother to the one who was killed, he announced, and he said that he got this authority from higher officers. He called out 6 men from Beatty's group. And the 6 men who were called out, 2 of them were innocent in all of this. And they took those 6 men down to a ravine, and they just shot them out of revenge. And there were some ladies that lived nearby, and they could hear the shots. And they ran down there to see. Every one of those men were dead. And then we find that there were 2 other men who showed up, and they temporarily buried them. But then the local people came and got them. There were 2 men who were innocent. Who were those 2 men? Right here. Joel Trotter, our great-great-great-third-great-great-great-grandfather, and Alexander Stanley. And we find that there was also John Street, James Street, William Silkey, and John F. Addison, who were all killed. They were part of the group, though, those other 4. But these 2 were not. And we find that Joel Trotter, a statement was made about him in 1881. And remember, this is our great-great-great-grandfather. This is what was said about him. Joel Trotter was universally esteemed, and we respect his memory to this day, which was 17 years later. And so he had been county surveyor, and at another time he was county assessor. And he was in the prime of his life, leaving his wife and small family, Susan Ann, and 6 children from the ages of 2 to 11, and the oldest being our great-great-grandma, Miriam Trotter Goodson. And so we find also that there was a young man named Alexander Stanley. And here's what's said about this man. He was a young man of much promise. He had a brother that was in the Union Army, and he was in Tennessee, and he was in a battle at Nashville. And this is what was said about him. His 36-year-old brother, Allen Wakefield Stanley, also died that year of wounds in a battle at Nashville, Tennessee. Can you imagine how the parents felt about those 2 boys of theirs, older brother and a younger brother? And here's something interesting also. Allen Wakefield Stanley married Mary Jane Goodson in December 1855. And this is her brother Alvin Goodson from the 1800s. And this picture came from the box that came from Uncle Kent. This picture right here. You see a little bit closer view of that. But Mary Rebecca Trotter, who was the daughter of Joel and Susan Trotter, and was called a nugget of gold by her grandfather, John Trotter. And Alvin Goodson was also the first cousin to our great-great-grandfather, James Josiah Goodson. And he was also married to Mary Rebecca Trotter, the younger sister to our great-great-grandma Miriam. So these 2 Goodson cousins married 2 Trotter sisters. They were first cousins who married 2 sisters there. Now, does anyone know who Alexander Stanley is in all this? Again, he was a young man of much promise. And his father's name was the Honorable James Stanley, the father of Alexander and brother to Joel Trotter's mother, Miriam Stanley Trotter. Joel and Alexander were first cousins. Joel was 34. He was 19. And so this is what was said of Mr. Stanley's. He was a judge. Mr. Stanley's court was the Supreme Court. No appeal was ever taken from that court. Both plaintiff and defendant quietly submitted to his decision, for they knew him to be a man of sterling moral integrity. Seldom have we been called upon to mourn the death of one whose past life has been so identified with the history of this county, and though he lived here for more than half a century, he had no enemies, but was known, honored, and beloved by all as a just and honest man. James was Joel Trotter's uncle. And you can go and you can see his tombstone there at the Trotter Cemetery in Carrollton, Missouri. And they set up a new tombstone for Joel Trotter's parents. And Miriam there is the sister to James Stanley. So that was a little bit of history about her husband, Joel Trotter. Now I want us to go through briefly some pictures of the descendants, the Goodson family. Joel's wife